The first thing I saw when I got off the highway wasn't my fence. It was a bank of stadium lights blazing across a piece of land that was supposed to be nothing but quiet rock and grass. For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd taken the wrong exit after 12 hours of flying home from Europe. But then I recognized the ridgeline, the old oak near the entrance, and the curve of my gravel road. And that's when my stomach dropped, because sitting right in the middle of my property was a full-blown private skate park packed with teenagers, parents holding phones, banners flapping in the breeze, and music echoing across ground I'd owned for nearly 15 years. I wish I could tell you I jumped out of the truck screaming, but the truth is I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, blinking like maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. My name is Ethan Calloway, and the land wasn't some forgotten lot I'd inherited or abandoned. It was 27 acres of old quarry ground outside a small town in western Pennsylvania. Rough limestone shelves mixed with shale, uneven enough that most developers had walked away from it years before I bought it. That was exactly why I wanted it. I wasn't looking for a subdivision or a shopping center. I liked the silence. I liked knowing deer crossed through every morning. That rainwater flowed naturally toward the creek below because I'd spent good money years earlier having engineers stabilize the drainage after buying the place. Every survey marker had been professionally recorded. Every property corner was documented with the county. The gravel entrance stayed locked behind a heavy steel gate, and the fence line stretched farther than most people bothered walking. To most folks, it looked like empty land. To me, it was the one place where nobody expected anything from me. I worked as an environmental consultant, which meant I spent half my life on airplanes solving other people's problems. So whenever I came home, that quarry became the only place where my phone stopped ringing and my brain finally slowed down. 4 years before all this happened, a developer bought the pasture bordering my western fence and turned it into one of those polished neighborhoods with matching mailboxes, decorative street lamps, stone entrance signs, and an HOA that seemed determined to regulate absolutely everything from mailbox colors to the height of flower beds. They named it Cedar Ridge Preserve, which always made me laugh because there wasn't much left to preserve after they'd paved over half the hillside. At first, we mostly ignored each other. I'd wave if I passed someone walking a dog. They'd wave back, and that was the end of it. Then the HOA elected a new president named Denise Harper. Denise had the kind of smile that somehow managed to feel rehearsed. Every conversation sounded friendly until you realized she'd already decided how it was supposed to end before you ever opened your mouth. The first time she stopped by my gate, she carried a leather folder under one arm and complimented my property for nearly 5 minutes before asking if I'd ever considered making it useful. I remember laughing because I honestly thought she was joking. I told her, "It's useful to me exactly the way it is." She tilted her head and looked across the quarry like she was mentally redesigning it. "That's such a shame," she said. "Land this close to a growing community should really serve more people." I smiled and answered, "That's an interesting opinion." She smiled right back. "Unused land always finds a purpose eventually." At the time, I shrugged it off. People say strange things when they're trying to convince themselves they know better than everyone else. A few weeks later, one of my neighbors, an older rancher named Walt, mentioned he'd seen surveyors walking suspiciously close to my fence while I was traveling for work. I checked my security cameras, but a storm had knocked the system offline for 2 days, so there wasn't much to see. I repaired everything, replaced a few batteries, and forgot about it. Looking back now, that should have been the moment I started paying closer attention. Instead, work called me overseas for what was supposed to be a 6-month environmental restoration project in Italy. 6 months turned into almost 9 after contract extensions kept piling up, and while I was busy inspecting riverbanks halfway around the world, life back home kept moving without me. Denise apparently discovered that an absent landowner makes a convenient obstacle to ignore. I didn't know she'd begun telling residents the rocky quarry beside their neighborhood had been donated for community recreation. I didn't know HOA newsletters were celebrating an exciting new youth project. I didn't know contractors were hauling concrete through my locked entrance after somebody conveniently removed the chain from my gate. I knew none of it until I turned off that highway and watched skateboarders flying through the air on structures that had absolutely no business existing on land my family and I had spent years protecting. Sitting there behind the wheel, I reached for my phone, found Denise's number still saved from that conversation years earlier, and after 3 rings, she answered with a cheerful voice that made my blood run cold. "Ethan," she said, almost laughing. "Welcome home. I was wondering when you'd finally come see what we've accomplished." Denise didn't even wait for me to say hello before she kept talking, sounding almost proud of herself. "Isn't it wonderful? The kids absolutely love it. The board voted unanimously. The neighborhood pitched in, and now we finally have something positive instead of that empty quarry collecting weeds." I stared through the windshield while a teenager launched off a concrete ramp that had been poured directly over one of my drainage channels, and I quietly asked, "Denise, are you telling me you built all of this on my property?" There was a pause, just long enough to tell me she understood exactly what I meant. Then she laughed. Actually laughed. "Well, if you believe that, you're welcome to discuss it with the HOA attorney. We've already handled all the legal issues." I thanked her for the information, wished her a pleasant afternoon, and hung up before she could say another word. People always expect anger because anger is predictable. Calm makes them nervous. I spent the next 2 hours walking every inch of the site without saying a word to anyone. Parents smiled at me, assuming I was another resident. A little boy asked if I wanted to try the half-pipe. Someone offered me a bottle of water. Nobody had the slightest idea they were standing in the middle of someone else's property. I photographed everything, every concrete pad, every steel rail anchored into the limestone, every banner carrying the Cedar Ridge Preserve logo, every trench dug for electrical wiring, every floodlight mounted into fresh foundations. I found my missing gate chain tossed into the weeds nearly 50 yards away, cut clean through with bolt cutters. Whoever organized this hadn't simply wandered across the property by mistake. They planned every step. That evening, I drove straight to Walt's farm. He looked at the pictures for less than 30 seconds before letting out a low whistle. "Son," he muttered, "they've gone and buried themselves." Then he told me something I hadn't known. Over the previous several months, he'd watched concrete trucks, excavators, and contractors coming and going almost every week. He'd asked one of the foremen whether they had permission from the owner. According to Walt, the foreman simply pointed toward the subdivision and said, "The HOA owns everything back here now." Hearing those words bothered me more than the skate park itself. Somebody had been telling contractors they owned land they had never purchased. The next morning, my attorney, Rebecca Sloan, met me at the county records office before we ever stepped onto the property. Rebecca wasn't dramatic. She didn't make speeches or promise revenge. She simply spread my original closing documents, survey maps, easement records, engineering reports, and tax history across a conference table and spent 3 quiet hours checking every line against current county records. Finally, she leaned back, adjusted her glasses, and smiled for the first time all morning. "Ethan," she said, "they didn't just build on your land. They built on some of the best documented private property I've ever seen." We hired a licensed survey crew that afternoon. By sunset, fresh orange flags marked every boundary exactly where they'd been sitting for more than a decade. The skate park wasn't inches inside my line. It wasn't even close. Nearly the entire facility sat well within my property, including the electrical service, drainage trench, spectator benches, and storage shed. Rebecca immediately contacted the city building department. 2 inspectors arrived 48 hours later, followed by an environmental engineer because part of the excavation crossed a protected runoff channel created during my restoration work years earlier. Watching those inspectors walk through the skate park almost felt surreal. Kids were still skating while officials measured concrete thickness, photographed exposed wiring, checked permits, and compared GPS coordinates with county plats. One inspector finally looked over at me and quietly asked, "Did you authorize any of this construction?" "Not one shovel of it," I answered. He slowly nodded, wrote something on his clipboard, and kept walking. Denise arrived about 20 minutes later wearing sunglasses and confidence that lasted exactly until she noticed the city vehicles. She marched straight toward Rebecca. "This inspection is completely unnecessary," she snapped. "Our attorney already reviewed everything." Rebecca smiled politely. "Wonderful. Then I'm sure he won't have any trouble explaining why your clients poured reinforced concrete on someone else's recorded property." Denise's expression barely changed, but I noticed the color drain from her face. She recovered quickly enough to point at me. "You've been gone almost a year. The community invested hundreds of volunteer hours improving neglected land that benefited nobody." I finally spoke. "Neglected?" I asked. "The drainage system underneath those ramps prevents flooding downstream. You pour concrete over infrastructure you never bothered identifying." She rolled her eyes. "You're exaggerating." The environmental engineer overheard that sentence and calmly interrupted. "Actually, he's understating it." He walked Denise over to one section where fresh concrete covered an engineered drainage swale. This design existed for erosion control. Blocking this runoff could eventually destabilize the hillside during severe storms. Denise tried changing the subject. "Well, if that's true, surely we can work something out," Rebecca answered before I could. "We're way past that conversation." 3 days later, Denise's attorney mailed us a beautifully printed proposal asking me to grant the HOA a permanent easement so the skate park could remain in place. The letter was full of polished language about community cooperation, shared values, neighborhood harmony, and mutual benefit. Hidden in the legal attachments was the part that made Rebecca laugh out loud. Their appraisal assigned my land a value of $0 because, according to their consultant, rocky quarry terrain had no meaningful commercial use. Rebecca slid the document across her desk toward me. "They've actually put this in writing." Instead of responding, she forwarded the entire package to the city attorney along with the inspection reports, environmental findings, survey certification, construction photographs, permit history, and county ownership records. The city moved far faster than Denise expected because the issue had grown beyond private property. There were now questions involving unauthorized excavation, unpermitted electrical work, environmental violations, and false representations made during construction. By the time the administrative hearing arrived, Denise no longer carried that easy confidence I'd seen at my gate years earlier. She sat beside two attorneys flipping nervously through binders while residents filled the back rows, many of them attending because they genuinely believed I was trying to take away something built for their children. I honestly couldn't blame them. Most had been told a completely different story. When the judge entered, the room became silent. He spent several minutes reviewing the inspection summary without looking at anyone. Then he lifted his eyes toward the HOA's legal team. "Can any party before this court produce a deed, easement, license, lease, written permission, or recorded ownership interest authorizing construction on Mr. Subsing Calloway's property?" Neither attorney answered immediately. One eventually stood and attempted to argue community reliance and implied consent because I'd been overseas. The judge stopped him before he'd finished his second sentence. "Ownership does not disappear because someone takes a trip," he said evenly. "Private property remains private property." The room became so quiet I could hear pages turning in someone's notebook behind me, and for the first time since landing back in Pennsylvania, I realized this entire mess was about to reach the point where excuses no longer mattered and consequences finally would. The judge closed the inspection report, tapped it once against the bench, and looked directly at Denise before saying the words that ended the entire argument. "The court authorizes immediate removal of all unauthorized structures. All demolition, restoration, environmental remediation, and associated legal costs shall be the responsibility of Cedar Ridge Preserve Homeowners Association." That was it. No dramatic speeches, no hours of testimony, no miracle defense. 15 minutes after the hearing began, it was over. Denise opened her mouth as if she wanted to protest, but her own attorney gently touched her arm and whispered something that convinced her to sit back down. Rebecca gathered our paperwork, smiled at me, and quietly said, "Let's go home." The next morning, I arrived just after sunrise. A light fog still hovered over the quarry, and for a brief moment it almost looked peaceful again, until the convoy appeared. 3 lowboy trailers rolled through the entrance behind 2 excavators, followed by dump trucks, a concrete recycling crew, environmental inspectors, and a city code officer carrying a clipboard thicker than a phone book. Unlike the construction crews months earlier, these workers knew exactly whose land they were standing on before anyone unloaded equipment. The city officer walked over, shook my hand, confirmed my identification, and asked one simple question. "Mr. Calloway, are you ready for us to begin?" I looked across the skate park one last time. Kids weren't there anymore. The music was gone. The colorful banners hung motionless in the morning air. "Go ahead," I answered. The first hydraulic hammer struck the main ramp with a crack that echoed across the valley. Concrete that had taken weeks to pour disappeared piece by piece in less than an hour. Steel rails were cut apart with torches. Benches were lifted onto trailers. Floodlights came down one after another. Parents and residents gathered outside the fence, watching silently while phones recorded every minute of it. Denise eventually arrived in a black SUV, climbed out before it had fully stopped, and marched toward the city officer. "You can't do this," she shouted. "We're filing for an injunction." The officer calmly handed her a certified copy of the court order without saying another word. She read the first page, flipped to the second, then looked toward the excavators already breaking apart another section of concrete. For the first time since I'd met her years earlier, she had absolutely nothing to say. She simply stepped aside while the machines continued their work. By late afternoon, the skate park that had supposedly become a permanent community landmark existed only as piles of broken concrete loaded into trucks headed for recycling facilities. Over the following weeks, the consequences kept growing. The HOA was built not only for demolition, but also for restoring the engineered drainage system they'd buried beneath concrete. Environmental monitoring became mandatory for future construction near the hillside. And because the violations involved protected runoff channels, the city required Cedar Ridge Preserve to submit enhanced environmental reviews for every significant development proposal over the next decade. Several homeowners later told me they had never known the land belonged to me at all. They'd been informed it was community property scheduled for recreational improvements from the beginning. Honestly, I believed them. Most families weren't trying to steal anything. They'd simply trusted the wrong people. A month later, Walt and I stood near the restored drainage channel, watching deer wander back across the quarry as if nothing had ever happened. He chuckled, nudged my shoulder, and said, "Looks like the wildlife finally got their neighborhood back." I laughed because after everything we'd been through, that simple sentence somehow felt more satisfying than winning in court. Today, the land looks almost exactly the way it did before I left for Europe. The grass has grown back over the repaired soil. Rainwater flows where it was designed to flow. The evenings are quiet again except for the wind moving through the trees. Every now and then, someone asks why I never sold the property after everything that happened. My answer is always the same. Some places don't need to make money to have value. Sometimes their value comes from simply being left alone. And maybe that's the lesson this whole mess taught me. Ownership isn't about squeezing every possible use out of a piece of land. It's about respecting boundaries, even when you think your idea is better than someone else's rights. Denise believed a good intention justified ignoring a property line. The court reminded everyone that it doesn't. Now I'd really like to hear what you think. If a piece of land sits unused for years, does a community ever have the moral right to transform it for the public without the owner's permission? Or should private property always remain untouchable, no matter how beneficial the project seems? Let me know where you stand in the comments, because I have a feeling this is one of those debates where reasonable people can end up on completely opposite sides. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates real stories about property rights, difficult neighbors, and the moments when patience turns out to be far more powerful than anger.